Hello and welcome to my feedback to your second Google Hangout on air. Rafael, I think one comment I have, you facilitated the Hangout very well, but one comment I have is I could barely hear you. So your quality of your recording was not very good, and I was losing a lot of information that you were talking about. So I apologize. I can't address the things that you were saying because I wasn't getting a whole lot out of it, and I hope your team had a better access to your audio than I did. And so a few comments on the session. It was a very well-run session. You started with politicization of intelligence and whether the issue, how it could be mitigated. Anna talked about favoritism, and I think that that's a valid point. That when you have a policy maker that sets requirements for intelligence, right there you have a potential for politicization of intelligence. And I think that, just start from the requirements. That's where you're going to see different agendas, and that's what Loventhal talked about. Naturally, also the terms in the office, are sometimes short, so the agendas change, and you will see a lot of that back and forth. Rafael, I did hear you on this one. You talked about, obviously, politicization is very evident, and it's very evident even today. For example, what's going on in the intelligence community right now with the firing of the FBI director, James Comey, and so you had a little discussion on that, and talking about bias, political affiliations, and the fact that intelligence, truly as it is described by Loventhal, is a service to a policymaker. It is the arm of the policymaker when you're looking at national intelligence. Obviously, it's a little bit different. I hope we think it's different at the domestic level, or the Homeland Security intelligence nexus. So you talked, Amy, you were mentioning the cherry picking and of issues, and what the intelligence focuses on and how they frame the issue is gonna dictate what the intelligence gatherer is gonna gather, analyze, and intelligence community officials deliver to the policymaker. Loventhal talks about that line, that is the imaginary line of the analyst not influencing the policymaker. And this is a very old school of Sherman Kent, who was the father of the American intelligence, at least in a conceptual foundation, who said that the job of the intelligence analyst is to warn, and for the policymaker is to heed the warning, to make the decision about that warning. So the analyst of the intelligence community has a job of bringing out the concerns to the policymaker, and the policymaker makes decisions on those. So generally, this is not a reciprocal process, and the reason is because the goal is not to have the analyst making policy recommendations, because they're not the policymaker. To what degree politicians are savvy in arcanes of intelligence, that's the problem on this other side of the line. So politicization cannot be avoided. Depending on political agendas, that those are set by politicians, there's going to be that political element to intelligence. And when we are talking about the intelligence, the question was if local domestic intelligence needs to be local. And I think that question was sort of kind of like, duh, isn't it? But I think what I really wanted you to think about is that intelligence, historically, because of all those things we've discussed, has been the domain of federal agencies. Federal agencies are standardized. They have protocols, they have processes that are uniform across the country, in every state and in every, at every level. Federal entities have processes that are standardized. This is very important because we are a decentralized nation as far as local law enforcement. We have different organizational structures with some other countries, but with federal law enforcement, they are, when you think about FBI with 56 field offices, it is the same standard of training. It is the same standard of expertise. It's the same standard of equipment. It's the same training academy. And that goes for, the DOD, and that goes for other members of the intelligence community. Now you are getting to local law enforcement, and you have, just in our area, 76 different law enforcement agencies in, Montgomery, Walker counties. So when you think about that, there is no standardization. There is no, there is different rank structure, there's different assessments, there's different training levels. Of course, there are some standards at the state level for police, for example, and the Texas Commission of Law Enforcement sets standards for training, but it's at the very basic level. So this is in that framework that I'm asking you a question: can intelligence gathering be local? And is it logical that it's local? And so this is where I want you to think about that discussion. Amy said, yeah, duh, of course it is. But is it intuitive? Is the intelligence part a natural fit for local law enforcement the way we have trained them and prepared them for their missions? Obviously, the intelligence processes should be local. I agree with that, but is local law enforcement properly equipped for intelligence missions? That's where the question. And I think that Amy talked a little bit about OSINT and analysis and the intelligence coming from the local levels and then getting to the national scene. And perhaps you were talking about fusion centers here, with those suspicious activities being fed into from the local level and then getting all the way to the federal levels and being analyzed, and patterns are being sought after and things like that. And so that's one part of that conversation. The other part of the conversation is philosophically, how the law enforcement has been trained. Are they truly prepared for intelligence gathering mission in a prevent mission area? Daniel talked about, it's not necessarily, and maybe Anna and Daniel both sort of took the conversation to say, maybe it's not necessarily that the local law enforcement is the best suited to do intelligence gathering. Maybe it is more about the collaboration or increased collaboration, because local law enforcement is the best positions to have access. But then the state and federal come with all those different resources and knowledge and training requisite to support that. And that's why there needs to be that balance of coordination. That's why those fusion centers are important. I think that Daniel brought that up. Amy mentioned the cloak of secrecy surrounding the fusion centers. I think that, the article, the ACLU article, even though a little dated, touched upon a lot of those concerns about accountability, about legality, about the responsibility and chain of command and ambiguity in reporting lines. And all those things have been identified as possibly being detrimental to the assessment or to the future of fusion centers. You had a really good discussion on the article raised the issue of guidelines, of many guidelines of what are the standards, and apparently different fusion centers might have differing missions in different locations based on risk assessments, based on vulnerabilities of the area. And I concur with that. But there also have to be some guidelines, when you talk about that veil of secrecy and transparency. And I think that, going on with your discussion, when we think about fusion centers, we now looking at 15, 16 years post 9/11, and perhaps we are better positioned now, many years after that article was printed, to refocus our assessment of fusion centers, to find ways to measure their efficiency and effectiveness better. Apparently, they are a good resource, but are they being an optimal resource? Maybe that's more of a question. When you talk to Amy talked about the common doctrine, and I think that's really important to, even though they might be different in certain areas, the common doctrine or common mission that is not clearly visible should be driving them. And then, we moved into the question on all hazards, how all hazards helps or impedes the mission of fusion centers. And Daniel talked about how all hazards is not very practical because, on one hand, it's not very practical because it's not specific enough. So you don't have indicators, so you don't have measurements because you're trying to cover all possible scenarios and plans. And different resources, specialized resources might be needed to be dealing with that type of event versus that type of event. However, I think that you agreed that some parts are there that have common anatomy. And I think the example, Daniel, you gave was that there's going to be a different issue with the terrorism, or is going to be a different issue with when the bridge falls. And I think that that's not necessarily the case, right? You're trying to make the point that there's going to be some common anatomy when you're looking at all hazards, and I think that that's where you nailed it. That's true. Some standards and some common features, like looking at transportation. Transportation is going to be relevant. It doesn't matter what kind of event you have. There's going to be a movement of people from to in every event, whether it's a terrorist event or if it's a bridge collapse or if it's a flood, there is a movement of people from to. There are evacuations, there are transportation issues. So you might be preparing for a natural hazard event, but you can leverage that capability because it's all about building capabilities. So you're building certain capabilities through all hazard approach. And I think that's very important to keep in mind because jurisdictions cannot possibly just survive supporting fusion centers on terrorism alone because the probability is so low, even though the consequences might be very, very high. So it still places terrorism right in that mid-range in risk assessments. But definitely for a lot of jurisdictions, it's not a top priority. So if you're looking at fusion centers under the all hazards approach and strengthening capabilities, interoperable communications, information sharing, law enforcement operations, medical operations, disaster mortuaries, family reunification centers, dissemination of information in crisis. All those are very common, shared across different range of events, be it human caused or technological or weather events. So I think that's, you were getting to this in that discussion, Daniel, I think, and it's true. At some point, there's going to be very specialized resources needed for certain type of events. But in the initial phase of response, when the things first happen, not often do you know what the cause was. You don't know if, plane hitting a building is a terrorist activity. So if you have a common approach to all that, then, it really may be the specificity of the event. So a certain type of investigation, there's going to be very specialized. That comes in a little bit later. And that's where the coordination with state and federal resources becomes relevant. So I think that you had a good discussion here. But there's at least some foundation and some template when you take into account the all-hazard approach. And you had a nice discussion on, we all talk about terrorism, but gang activity is more likely, right, in a particular jurisdiction. Flood is more likely for Texas than a terrorist activity, but we are preparing for evacuations. We are preparing for medical capability of handling mass casualties, be it from the flood or from, shrapnel wounds. So, and then here is where you're going to need special surgery and special, burn units or whatever you might need, or prophylaxis in the event of a biological event. So, so it helps you when you prepare for hazards. It helps you test your capabilities, and you touched on that. Amy talked about all hazard approach helps build community awareness. Again, it's that planning and preparedness. And it's really interesting because when you think about prevent mission area, prevent really deals with threats. Prevent really deals with security issues. But we also have the other dimension, prepare and plan. And prepare and plan is when you are in that front phase for sudden events that are not man-caused. So the safety issues, weather issues. And whether you are in a plan or prepare or prevent, you are building capabilities. The important thing is that the intelligence is really part of it. That's not criminal intelligence. The intelligence with terrorism is in that front phase. And so it's nice to think about, in addition to intelligence, which is the core of our class this semester, it's good to think about the cycle of pre-event, during event, post-event, and recovery and mitigation. And if you think about events that way, it's going to be easier for you to sort of think about intelligence starting, in that pre-phase. Because when we think about law enforcement, typically we think about criminal intelligence. It's after the boom. It's after something happens. So Amy had a good point on communities and community preparedness. And community preparedness is also when you prepare communities for anything, for flood, for any types of hazards, you're also building relationships and trust with the community. If you have trust with the community, then the community will share possibly what the officers can't extract from the community because they have no probable cause or because of Fourth Amendment issues. So all those things are very connected, and it helps, the all hazard helps maybe leverage that. Coordinating efforts while dealing with the unknowns. And I think that's, you spoke directly to the fusion center or, all hazards approach. You can't possibly prepare for every eventuality, but you are building collaborative processes that can be leveraged later, whatever the event that happens. And this is sort of connected to what's called the swarm intelligence, which is not the intelligence in national security, the way we've been discussing it this semester. It has more to do with decision making in groups during an event. And you have swarm intelligence manifest itself in groups of people that have coordinated and collaborated and know their place and their contributions beforehand. So again, this is testing capabilities for decision making for when the event does happen. So again, Fusion centers do offer that platform of people coming in and exchanging business cards and telling, this is what I do, this is my field, this is, this is what I know, this is what I can share, this is what I can't share. And so that in itself, it's a great start to building capability for when things do happen. So it's not just that preventative role of Fusion Center, it's that synergy building role of a Fusion Center, which is very hard to assess and very hard to measure and very hard to spit out in dollar value and efficiency, perhaps. So then you had some really interesting conversation on suspicious activity reports. Amy talked about how you're getting 41,000 of those yearly, and you attend to every single one. And obviously, Houston Police Department being fourth largest in the nation, having 5,000 plus officers does have the luxury of having separate divisions for either counterterrorism or criminal intelligence and disaster catastrophic events. So you have very specialized entities that do have training and knowledge requisite to be dealing with this type of information or even gathering intelligence, which in most cases in Texas, again, 80 to 85% of police departments have less than 15 officers. Houston is, the outlier. And the major cities, there's 5 or 6 of them in Texas. Taken aside, the majority of police departments are small. So, that's, the case of Houston is a great national showcase, and we do have critical infrastructure and vulnerable symbolic resources in the Houston area. So obviously it's a very target-rich environment when you're talking about terrorism, but we have to be cognizant that other areas could be as vulnerable, and that's the areas that don't have those resources. You mentioned about a lot of criminal intelligence division, a lot of specialized resources, X-rays, bomb dogs used in special events, rodeos, special event planning. I think you might have mentioned the Super Bowl. And so from the perspective of somebody from the large police department, law enforcement is pretty well prepared, to be dealing with the intelligence of prevent mission area. How does prevent mission area look in Cleveland, Texas, or Willis, Texas, or I don't want to name specific agencies, they'll just come to mind because they're close to me. Might be another question. Do they have the requisite equipment to be doing that type of work? So Daniel, and you touched on it, that the next conversation you had was about private-public partnership in a fusion center. And you talked about the issues with private companies and individuals not having the need to know with certain information sharing. And Daniel, I think you were talking about the lack of standardized training of what needs to be shared, or standards. I think that's what you were referring to. And that the government agencies cannot control how private entities train their employees as far as information security. And I think that your focus was truly, and it's very interesting because it permeates from most of the groups, you focus on the potential threat that the private sector brings to the integrity of intelligence at the fusion center that is owned by the government entities. And you tend to focus on that, you know, if they are to be a player, they are really not qualified enough to safeguard that intelligence, which, you know, a lot of private corporations have high security clearances. And a lot of them deal with matters that are, you know, they own critical infrastructure that is a vital lifeline of this country: the hospitals, the railways, the you know, the oil industry and energy, the water reservoirs. So the question I want to pose to you, or something to think about, is how do they feel about the Fed or the state agency or the public services being able to protect what they've got to share? Because they have you know, ultimately very highly critical assets. They have intellectual property, a lot of those corporations. They have patent issues. They have information, proprietary information that needs to be safeguarded. And the argument can be raised if the federal government cannot protect its own records from cybersecurity breaches, for example, like the Office of Personnel Management a couple of years ago, you know, where thousands of federal employees' records were compromised. How can the private industry trust, you know, with sharing their information with the public sector? So think from that side as well, because, and think back to the case of the San Bernardino murderers and their phone, their Apple phone that for a while couldn't be decrypted for the use in investigative purposes for the FBI intelligence services. So, and of course, Apple said no, right? I mean, there was, the Fed found a way to access this information, but it was a very fierce and very bitter fight on the public forum about that. And, you know, Apple said, you know, we owe the loyalty to our customers. We safeguard our trade secrets. We protect our proprietary information of a design. And we're not going to release that because that's a slippery slope. So, you know, it's interesting to talk about the private-public partnerships, but at some point there are conflicting interests also at play. So, you know, those are definitely challenges of a private-public partnership. And so, yes. Talking about intelligence gathering, again, I think, Amy, you talked about how in a pre-event or pre-event, law enforcement is limited in their authority. And I still think that, you know, the question that needs to be asked is, isn't it a different mindset between, again, criminal investigations and the investigations prior? Doesn't it take a different way of thinking from the reasoning that's purely deductive when you have explanatory, you know, when you're looking for pieces of a case or leads and you're building a case, to the things that have not happened, and you're projecting and you're hypothesizing, and you have a totally different mindset when you speculating. There is not much speculating going in criminal investigations, or shouldn't be, right? It's, you know, fact-based and evidence-based, whereas, you know, in intelligence gathering, it's, you know, it's reverse. So is that a challenge for local law enforcement? That's just a question for you. Daniel talked about, you went back to the ACLU article, talked about the lines of authority in fusion centers. Who is in charge? That's been an issue also in crisis management and emergency management, and this issue of unified command came about, and that's would be interesting to look at that, perhaps from the crisis management side, response side, to look at the fusion centers and the concept of unified command. And Amy was talking about the issue of definition, the problem definition, and the definition in Homeland Security. We lack a lot of clear-cut definitions. And so even what intelligence at the domestic intelligence is, what, are we looking at? What are the indicators? What are the markers? What are the benchmarks? If you don't know the basic definitions, you can't answer the questions that need to be answered. Perhaps you can't even pose the right questions. And I think that was Rafael that was talking about that, as much as I could hear from Rafael. What else? You had a little bit of a discussion, I think, Daniel and Rafael, on collection and the Freedom Act and amendments to the Patriot Act. And there was a discussion on how come when Google or Facebook or other outlets, siphon out millions of bytes of information on our preferences and creating profiles of our shopping styles and what we do and where we go and all that, we don't get bent out of shape. But when the government does it, why don't we want to share with the government? And I think that the answer is relatively simple. It's because we do not expect Google or Facebook or other private entities, that private sector, to have any obligation to us. They do not have an obligation to us. They exist for profit. That is their mission. That's what they do. They collect data to propel and support their growth of their industries. We have a different expectations from the government. We pay the government to protect us. The basic mission of a nation state is to offer us safety and security. This is what our taxes go for. And there is a huge expectation of that is not there with the private sector. So we are comparing, apples to oranges. Yes, we abandon our expectation of privacy with those private entities because we are living in this kind of society that is a capitalist society. And yet the government is expected to protect us. And that's the sole purpose of a government, truly. The establishment of a government is to protect our sovereignty from the attacks that are external, and to ensure prosperity, happiness, and well-being of us inside. Otherwise, we really don't need government, do we? So, this is a basic function, and that's why we are a lot more sensitive to the intelligence collection, and the use, particularly because it is politicized, as you all noted. So, what you talking about? So you were talking a little bit about how you can access information about what's out there on the web. The ubiquity of, I think, of open source intelligence. Anna likes to read Inspire, I think, and you're talking, I think, about how terrorists are leveraging a lot of social media outlets to recruit, and also how sovereign citizens and lone wolves and other entities can get radicalized through the internet. And I'm not sure what was in relation to. I think perhaps the vastness of information that's out there, and the necessity to cast a really wide net, and again, access to information, open source intelligence is huge, and that is being leveraged to the benefit um, of those people that are consuming it. And then, of course, you are probably being tagged for visiting those sites, and it's probably a little bit you really don't mind that, because a lot of you said that, if you don't have anything to hide. But anyway, overall, you covered all the points. You talked about fusion centers and effectiveness, and, do they have enough to show in supporting of the proper intelligence processes, or intelligence fusion between federal all the way to local, because it is at that local level where we're trying to refocus our domestic intelligence activities. Really good perspectives in your group. You have law enforcement in your midst, and traditional students that bring good perspectives. So I wanted to thank you, and see you next time.